the middle of the 19th century, in a small town called Amherstburg, Ontario, a boy was born who would one day help bring law and order to one of the wildest towns in American history. His name was Seth Bullock. From the very start, Seth's world was far from gentle. His father, George Bullock, was a retired sergeant major from the British Army, a man of discipline, rules, and rigid control. His mother, Agnes Findlay, tried to bring warmth to the house, but tragedy came early. When Seth was still a child, his mother passed away, leaving him alone with his father's harsh expectations and a silence that echoed through the house. George Bullock believed that strength came from punishment and obedience. Seth believed that strength came from courage and justice. Two very different worlds existed under one small roof, and every day those worlds collided. Seth spent his childhood dreaming of freedom, of open skies, mountains, and the roar of the frontier. He often stared out the window at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond the borders of Ontario. He wanted something bigger than the strict life he knew. He wanted adventure, and maybe peace. By the age of 13, his father's temper had grown harder. The constant shouting, the drills, the endless orders. It was too much for a boy who wanted to live free. One cold morning, Seth packed what little he had and ran away from home. He didn't get far. The wilderness of Canada was not kind to a boy with no plan. He was found and brought back home, but something inside him had already changed. He no longer feared punishment. He feared living a life without purpose. 3 years later, he left again. This time, he didn't come back. Seth crossed the border into the United States and traveled westward. The world beyond Ontario was rough and untamed, and he loved it. By the time he reached Montana territory, he had seen enough hardship to know what survival meant. In Montana, he was still young, but his eyes carried the look of a man who had seen too much. He worked odd jobs, learned to ride, to shoot, to trade. Every town was different, but one thing stayed the same. There were always people who took advantage of others, and there was never enough justice. He began to understand something that would define the rest of his life. Without law, there is no peace. Without fairness, there is no freedom. By his early 20s, Seth Bullock had made a name for himself in the town of Helena, Montana. He wasn't rich, but people respected him. He was honest, hardworking, and brave. The kind of man who didn't talk much but got things done. In 1873, at only 24 years old, he ran for sheriff of Lewis in Clark County, and won. For the first time, Seth Bullock wore a badge, and he wore it with pride. Helena in the 1870s was not a peaceful place. It was a mix of miners, gamblers, drifters, and dreamers, all chasing gold and fortune. Fights broke out daily, theft was common, and many believed that power came from the fastest gun. But Seth didn't see it that way. He believed that power came from courage, the kind that didn't need violence to be respected. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face that never smiled easily. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, and rarely raised his voice. Yet when he walked into a room, even the toughest men stepped aside. People said his stare could stop a man in his tracks, calm, cold, and certain. It wasn't just a look. It was a warning, a promise that he would do what was right, no matter who stood against him. As sheriff, Seth's job wasn't easy. He had to face killers, thieves, and outlaws who believed they could run wild forever. But he also had to face something harder, the people who had lost faith in justice. He knew that if he wanted order, he couldn't rely only on his gun. He needed to show people that the law could be stronger than fear. That's what made him different. By 1876, Seth's reputation had spread far beyond Montana. People spoke of a sheriff who didn't flinch, who didn't compromise, and who didn't need violence to prove his strength. But Seth wasn't thinking about fame. He was thinking about something bigger. That same year, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, in a lawless region called Deadwood. The name itself sounded dangerous. A town where outlaws, fortune seekers, and killers mixed freely. A place with no law, no order, no peace. To most men, Deadwood was a gamble. To Seth Bullock, it was a calling. Together with his business partner Saul Starr, Seth packed up his life and headed for the Dakota Territory. They planned to open a hardware store and maybe earn a living selling tools and supplies to miners. But when he arrived in Deadwood, he found something more powerful than gold. He found chaos. There were no sheriffs, no courts, and no rules. Gunfire was common. Murders went unpunished. It was the kind of town that swallowed good men whole. And as Seth Bullock looked down the muddy, crowded main street of Deadwood, he knew exactly what he had to do. He had left home long ago, searching for freedom. Now he had found his purpose. The boy who ran from discipline was now the man who would bring it to the Wild West. This was not just the story of a sheriff. It was the story of a man who stared down chaos and didn't blink. When Seth Bullock first rode into Deadwood in 1876, it was not a town. It was chaos wearing the mask of opportunity. There were no laws, no sheriffs, no jails. Only gold, greed, and guns. The streets were muddy and crowded with wagons. Men shouted, deals were made in whispers, and somewhere, a pistol fired. The smell of smoke and whiskey hung in the air like a fog. This was the Black Hills gold rush, and every man here wanted his piece of fortune. No matter who stood in the way, Seth had come to Deadwood with his friend and partner, Saul Starr. They weren't lawmen this time, not yet. They were businessmen, planning to open a hardware and supply store. Starr was the cheerful one, a man of numbers and optimism. Seth was quiet, focused, always watching. They set up their store right on the main street, a simple wooden building filled with tools, pans, ropes, and the promise of stability in a town built on chaos. For a while, things went well. Miners needed supplies, and Bullock and Starr became trusted names. But every day, Deadwood reminded them both that peace was only temporary. One night, a gunfight broke out outside their store. Seth stepped out to stop it, not with a weapon, but with words. Two drunken miners were arguing over a gold claim, their hands trembling over their holsters. Seth didn't shout. He just stood there, tall and calm, his eyes locked on theirs. "Put the guns down," he said in a low, steady voice, and somehow they did. That was the thing about Seth Bullock. He didn't need to pull a trigger. His presence was enough, but as more fights broke out and more blood was spilled, Seth began to realize something. This town didn't need another storekeeper. It needed a lawman. Soon after, fate made its move. Word spread that a local miner had been murdered. The suspect was caught, but there was no law, no judge, and no one to decide justice. Angry miners gathered, ready to hang the man themselves. Seth stepped forward, demanding that there be a fair trial, but no one listened. The mob's fury drowned out reason. The man was lynched that night. Seth watched in silence as chaos ruled the streets once again. That moment stayed with him. It wasn't just about the crime. It was about the loss of order, the loss of something human. That was the night Seth Bullock decided that Deadwood needed a sheriff, and if no one else would do it, he would. By early 1877, Bullock was appointed the first sheriff of Lawrence County, which included Deadwood and the entire surrounding area. He accepted the badge not for glory, but because someone had to. Someone had to bring peace to a place where peace didn't exist. His first day wearing the star, people noticed the difference immediately. He didn't come into town with an army. He didn't make threats. He simply walked the streets, straight-backed, steady, and silent. Men stopped fighting when they saw him. Women felt safer when he passed by, and the outlaws, they took notice. Seth's biggest challenge came when he had to arrest one of the most feared men in the Black Hills, a gambler known for shooting anyone who crossed him. Most sheriffs would have waited for backup. Seth went alone. He walked straight into the saloon where the man sat, surrounded by his gang. Everyone fell silent. The piano stopped. You could hear the creak of the floorboards under Seth's boots. He said only one thing. "Get up." "You're coming with me." The gambler laughed until he saw Seth's eyes. They were cold, unshaken, the eyes of a man who didn't bluff. The outlaw hesitated, then stood, put down his drink, and followed him out. No handcuffs, no violence, just authority. That's how Seth Bullock ruled Deadwood, not with a gun, but with presence. His badge wasn't just metal, it was moral weight. Under his watch, Deadwood began to change. Saloons still roared, gamblers still played, but there was order, a fragile kind, born out of respect. He built relationships with business owners, miners, and travelers. He made sure the innocent were protected and the guilty were judged fairly. For the first time, Deadwood started to believe in something greater than fear. But being sheriff came at a cost. Seth was a man of duty, and duty left little room for rest. Every day he faced new threats, ambushes, shootouts, and betrayal. And in those moments, when the town was one spark away from burning again, He always stood between danger and peace. It was as if he carried the weight of the entire frontier on his shoulders. Still, he wasn't alone. His partner and friend, Saul Starr, stayed by his side, running their business, managing the town, and supporting Seth's fight to make Deadwood a place worth living in. Together, they were more than entrepreneurs. They were builders of a civilization rising from dust and gunpowder. By the late 1870s, the once lawless town began to calm. Trade grew, families moved in, schools opened, and the name Seth Bullock became a symbol, not just of law, but of hope. He had done what no one thought possible. He had tamed the Wild West, one stare at a time, but peace in Deadwood would not last forever. As the years rolled on, fire, greed, and change would test everything he built. The next chapter of Seth Bullock's story would prove that even heroes must rise again from the ashes. He walked into a lawless town and left behind a legend. But for Seth Bullock, order was only the beginning. Next time, the fire that nearly destroyed everything he stood for. By the early 1890s, Deadwood had changed. The gunfights were fewer, the nights were quieter, and the people no longer looked over their shoulders every time a door slammed. The town that had once been ruled by chaos was now a place of business, family, and peace, all thanks to one man's steady hand. Sheriff Seth Bullock had done what no one else could. But peace never lasted long in the Wild West. When gold fever faded, many towns died with it. But Seth Bullock was not a man to give up. He believed Deadwood could survive, not as a mining camp, but as a thriving, civilized town. Together with his trusted friend and business partner Saul Starr, he worked tirelessly to build something lasting. Their hardware store became the heart of the town, a place where miners bought their tools. Ranchers came for supplies and travelers stopped to trade stories. Inside, the walls smelled of pine and iron, and the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. It wasn't just a store, it was a symbol. Proof that Deadwood could build, not just destroy. But the West had a cruel way of testing even the strongest souls. On a dry day in September 1894, that test came in the form of fire. It started small, a single spark in a bakery down the street. Within minutes, flames spread from one wooden building to another, leaping across rooftops and exploding through windows. The wind carried fire like a living creature, hungry and merciless. Seth was at his store when he saw the black smoke curling into the sky. He ran outside, shouting for help, grabbing buckets, pulling water, but it was no use. The flames were too fast, too strong. By nightfall, Deadwood was burning. Men and women ran through the streets carrying what little they could. Children cried as homes turned to ash. The once bustling Main Street glowed red like a river of fire. Seth and Saul fought to save their store, but the inferno devoured everything in its path. When the smoke cleared, all that remained of the Bullock and Starr hardware store was a pile of blackened debris and twisted iron. Years of hard work, gone in a single night. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ashes of Deadwood, the town was silent. People stood in disbelief, their faces gray with soot and loss. Some spoke of leaving, heading east, away from this cursed place. But Seth Bullock didn't move. He stood on the ashes of his store, his boots black with soot, and made a promise. Deadwood would rise again. And so would he. Seth and Saul refused to give up. Where others saw ruin, they saw an opportunity, a chance to build something even greater. This time, they would build not just a store, but a landmark, a place that would represent Deadwood's rebirth. And so, on the same ground where their store had burned, the men began construction on a new dream, the Bullock Hotel. It would be no ordinary hotel. Seth wanted it to stand tall, proud, and permanent, a building that fire could never destroy. Made of sturdy sandstone and brick, it would rise 3 stories high, with grand staircases, polished wood, and the finest craftsmanship in the Black Hills. As construction began, the townspeople watched with admiration. They saw the sheriff who had once brought them peace now bringing them hope again. Every brick laid was a reminder. Deadwood may burn, but it would never die. When the Bullock Hotel opened its doors in 1896, it was more than just a business. It was a symbol of renewal. Travelers from all over came to stay. The lobby glowed with lantern light, and laughter once again filled the streets. It was the finest hotel in the Dakota Territory, elegant, modern, and strong, and at its heart stood Seth Bullock. The same man who had stared down outlaws now stood as a builder of dreams. But Seth wasn't one to rest on success. To him, the Bullock Hotel was just another way to serve his town. He believed prosperity brought stability, and stability meant peace. He invested in ranches, supported railroads, and helped turn Deadwood into a center of trade for the entire region. Through hard work, he and Sol Star helped found the nearby town of Belforche, offering land and incentives to the railroad to make it a shipping hub. That decision would make Belforche one of the most important cattle towns in the West. Seth Bullock was no longer just a sheriff, he was a visionary, but beneath the calm surface, something restless stirred in him. He missed the frontier days, not the violence, but the purpose. He had tamed Deadwood, built an empire, and kept his word. Yet a part of him still longed for the wild, for challenge, for meaning. That calling would soon return in the most unexpected way, through a meeting that would change his life forever. He had built a town from ashes and a legacy from fire. But destiny wasn't finished with Seth Bullock, because soon he would meet a man who saw in him the spirit of the American West itself, a man named Theodore Roosevelt. By the late 1880s, Seth Bullock had done what many men only dreamed of. He had brought law to the lawless, built a town from ashes, and earned the respect of every soul in Deadwood. But even as he built businesses and raised his family, the old fire inside him, that restless frontier spirit, never truly went out. He was a man who needed purpose, something bigger than himself. And that purpose would ride into his life one summer day in the form of another man who loved the wild just as much as he did, Theodore Roosevelt. It was 1884 when the two first crossed paths. Roosevelt was not yet president, not even close. He was a young, wealthy New Yorker who had come west to escape heartbreak and tragedy. He had lost both his wife and mother on the same day. To heal, Roosevelt sought out the Dakotas, the endless sky, the open plains, the kind of land that tested a man's soul. He came looking for solitude, but he found friendship instead. The first time Seth Bullock met Theodore Roosevelt, it wasn't in a palace or office. It was on the rough frontier, surrounded by dust and horses, the smell of campfire and pine in the air. Roosevelt, dressed in his cowboy gear, had the look of a man out of place, but only at first glance. He spoke with enthusiasm, his words quick and sharp, full of energy and conviction. Seth, on the other hand, was calm, grounded, and quietly confident. Two very different men, one born to politics, the other born to the wild, yet they understood each other instantly. Roosevelt saw in Bullock something he admired, real courage, the kind that came not from titles, but from action. Bullock saw in Roosevelt something rare, a man of privilege who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Their friendship grew fast, bound by shared values, honor, fairness, and hard work. Both believed in the spirit of the frontier, the idea that character, not comfort, was what made a man great. The two spent long days riding together through the Dakota hills, talking about life, leadership, and the kind of America they both wanted to build. Roosevelt later said that Seth Bullock was the ideal frontiersman, brave, loyal, and absolutely straight. And Bullock would say that Roosevelt was a man who understood the West like no other. It wasn't a friendship built on politics. It was built on respect. Years passed. Roosevelt returned east and rose quickly through the ranks of American politics: police commissioner, governor, vice president, and finally, president of the United States. But he never forgot his friend from Deadwood. When he took the oath of office in 1901, after the death of President McKinley, Roosevelt brought the spirit of the West with him, the courage, honesty, and grit he had seen in men like Bullock. And when it came time to honor those who embodied that spirit, Roosevelt knew exactly who to call. In 1905, as Roosevelt prepared for his presidential inauguration, he sent a message westward. He wanted a troop of men, real cowboys, sheriffs, and frontiersmen, to lead the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. He called them his cowboy cavalry, and at the front of that troop rode Seth Bullock. Imagine the sight. Washington, D.C., streets lined with thousands of cheering people, the sky bright with flags, the band playing the national anthem. And through the crowd, riding tall in his hat and boots, came a man from Deadwood, a lawman who had tamed one of the wildest places on earth. As he passed the White House reviewing stand, Roosevelt saluted him with a proud smile. Two friends, one a president, one a sheriff, now stood as symbols of the very same idea, that courage and integrity could build a nation as surely as any army. After the parade, Roosevelt appointed Bullock as U.S. Marshal for South Dakota, one of the most honorable positions a man could hold. It was more than friendship, it was trust. Roosevelt knew Bullock would enforce the law with fairness and respect, just as he always had, and Bullock did not disappoint. For years he served as Marshal, overseeing justice in the Dakotas with the same steady hand he had once used in Deadwood. He rode the plains, inspected frontier posts, and made sure that peace, true peace, remained in the land he loved. When Roosevelt left office, their bond never faded. Letters passed between them often, filled with memories of the old days, hunting trips, campfires, and the shared belief that America's future depended on the strength of its people. In many ways, they were reflections of each other. Roosevelt was the voice of the frontier spirit in politics. Bullock was its living proof. In 1919, when Roosevelt passed away unexpectedly, the news hit Bullock hard. He lost not just a president, but a brother, a man who understood him like no other. And as he stood on a hill in South Dakota, staring at the horizon, Seth made another silent promise, one last mission to honor his old friend. He would build something lasting, a monument high above the plains, where the wind could carry the memory of Theodore Roosevelt forever. They came from different worlds, one born to command, one born to survive. But together, they showed that leadership doesn't come from power. It comes from courage, character, and friendship. Seth Bullock had found his equal, and in honoring him, he would cement his own place in history. When Theodore Roosevelt became president, he didn't forget the men who had stood beside him in the hardest of days. Among them, no man stood taller than Seth Bullock, the lawman from Deadwood who had brought order to chaos and honor to the frontier. In 1905, Roosevelt made it official. He appointed Seth Bullock as the U.S. Marshal for South Dakota, a position of power, but also of trust. For Bullock, it wasn't about titles or rewards. It was about service. He had spent his life protecting others, and he wasn't about to stop now. As U.S. Marshal, Bullock was responsible for enforcing federal law across one of the roughest and most unpredictable regions in the country. He was no longer the young sheriff who faced down outlaws in muddy streets, but he was still the same man inside. His posture was straight, his eyes steady, and his word was law. He traveled across the Dakotas inspecting posts, meeting officers, and ensuring justice was fair, not cruel. Even those who had once broken the law respected him. They said that when Marshal Bullock spoke, you listened, not out of fear, but out of respect. The world around him was changing fast. The Wild West was fading. Railroads now ran where wagon trails once wound through empty hills. Towns that were once built from tents now had banks, schools, and newspapers. To some, it was the end of an era. But to Bullock, it was proof that his life's work meant something, that the wilderness he helped tame had finally become a home for thousands. And yet, he never forgot the land that had shaped him. When he wasn't working as marshal, he spent his time managing his ranch near Belforche, riding the plains he loved. He would often wake before sunrise, step out into the open air, and watch the sky turn from deep blue to gold. The same skies he had seen as a boy dreaming of freedom. Seth Bullock was a man of discipline. Even in his later years, he lived by routine, early mornings, long rides, and hard work. He expected the same of everyone around him. His children learned early that honesty mattered more than success, and effort mattered more than comfort. To his neighbors, he was more than a lawman. He was a leader, someone people came to for advice, for help, or simply to listen. He was respected not for his title, but for his consistency. He didn't just talk about integrity. He lived it every single day. Though his role as marshal kept him busy, Bullock's heart always returned to Deadwood. He had watched it rise from fire and dust into a thriving town. Every time he walked past the Bullock Hotel, he felt pride, not for the building itself, but for what it represented. Perseverance. Some said he would walk its halls late at night, checking that everything was in order. just like he used to walk the streets decades earlier when Deadwood was young. For him, order was peace, and peace was worth guarding forever. Even as age caught up to him, Bullock never slowed down. He continued his duties as Marshal with the same precision and courage that had defined his life. He rode through snowstorms to attend hearings, mediated disputes with ranchers, and kept the law alive in towns that might have forgotten it otherwise. People often asked him why he never retired. He'd smile faintly and say, "A man's duty doesn't end when his boots wear out." But fate, as always, had other plans. In January 1919, news arrived that broke the old lawman's heart. Theodore Roosevelt was dead. Bullock received the telegram in his office. He didn't speak for a long time. The man who had once been his commander, his president, and his closest friend, was gone. That night, Seth didn't go home. He saddled his horse and rode out to the hills under a cold, starless sky. He rode for hours alone with his thoughts. When he finally stopped, he looked toward the northern horizon, where the plains met the heavens, and whispered, "I'll see you again, old friend." But before that day came, Seth Bullock had one last duty to fulfill. He gathered a group of men from Deadwood and Belforche and proposed building a memorial to Roosevelt, a tower that would stand high above the Black Hills, something solid, something lasting, a monument to the kind of man Roosevelt had been and the kind of men the West had produced. Work began that same year. Even though Bullock was growing weak from illness, he supervised as much as he could. He wanted the tower to face the plains, where the wind would carry Roosevelt's spirit across the land they both loved. That monument still stands today, Mount Roosevelt, or as locals call it, Friendship Tower, and at its heart lies the story of two men who believed in duty above all else. Not long after the tower's completion, Seth Bullock fell ill. He had lived a long, full life, but his body had grown tired. He spent his final days quietly in Deadwood, surrounded by family and memories of a life well lived. On September 23, 1919, the West lost one of its last true heroes. He had tamed a town, built a city, and carried justice through an untamed land. He never sought fame, only fairness. He lived by the law and died by his word. And when they laid him to rest, it was on a hill above Deadwood, facing the monument he built for his friend. Watching over the land he helped make free. By the autumn of 1919, the town of Deadwood had grown calm and civilized. The gold rush was long over. The days of gunfights and gambling halls had faded into dusty memory. But one man still carried the spirit of those wild years, the same man who had tamed them. His name was Seth Bullock. For more than 40 years, he had stood at the heart of the American frontier, lawman, businessman, U.S. Marshal, friend of presidents, and builder of towns. But now, at 70 years old, his once strong body began to fail him. The same man who had chased outlaws across mountains, who had stared down killers without blinking, now fought a quieter enemy, illness. Doctors said it was cancer. Seth didn't complain. He never did. He faced it with the same quiet strength he had shown every day of his life. He spent his last months surrounded by his family, his wife Martha and their 3 children. Each morning, he asked to sit near the window where he could see the hills. Even as pain wore him down, his gaze stayed steady, his eyes still full of life. He would point toward the horizon and say softly, "Out there." That's where a man learns who he really is. Sometimes he would ask to be taken outside. He'd sit in the saddle of his old horse not to ride far, just to feel the wind, the same wind that had once carried the scent of the Black Hills. It was his way of saying goodbye. On September 23, 1919, as the sun set behind the mountains, Seth Bullock took his final breath. He was 70 years old, and in that moment, the American frontier lost one of its last true guardians. News of his passing spread quickly. From the Dakotas to Washington, people remembered the man who had lived without fear and served without fail. The newspapers called him the last of the true Western lawmen. But for the people of Deadwood, he was more than that. He was their sheriff, their protector, their legend. His funeral was held on a quiet afternoon. People filled the streets, lining the path as the procession made its way up the hill. The air was still, the sky pale with the light of late autumn. Men removed their hats, women bowed their heads, and the sound of hooves echoed softly through the town he had once saved. At his request, he was buried on Mount Moriah Cemetery, overlooking Deadwood. But his grave was placed higher than the rest, on a hill facing north toward Mount Roosevelt, the monument he had built for his old friend. So even in death, Seth Bullock kept watch over his town and over the tower that symbolized friendship, duty, and the spirit of the West. Years passed and Deadwood changed again. The modern world grew around it, cars replaced horses, and the gold mines fell silent. But one building remained a constant reminder of Seth's legacy, the Bullock Hotel. The grand sandstone structure still stood tall on Main Street, its windows catching the morning light, its halls echoing with whispers of the past. And some said, Seth Bullock never really left it. The stories began quietly, guests and staff speaking in hushed tones. They said strange things happened in the hotel late at night. Doors opened on their own, footsteps echoed down empty hallways. And sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, people swore they saw a tall man in an old-fashioned suit standing near the staircase, his eyes sharp, his presence calm. He never spoke. He never threatened. He simply watched, as if making sure everything was still in order. Those who believed said it was Seth Bullock, still keeping an eye on his hotel, still protecting Deadwood in his own quiet way. Even the skeptics admitted the feeling was hard to explain. The hotel felt watched over, safe. Today, over a century later, the Bullock Hotel still stands. Tourists visit from around the world, not just to stay in a historic hotel, but to feel a piece of the Wild West that still lingers in the air. Many come for the legend, but they leave with something else: respect. Because Seth Bullock wasn't just another name in history. He was proof that one person's strength and integrity could outlive the chaos of their time. Historians call him the man who brought law to the Black Hills. But to those who truly knew him, he was more than a sheriff or marshal. He was a builder of towns, of trust, and of peace. He stood for honesty when it was easier to look away, for justice when it was dangerous to enforce it, and for friendship that lasted beyond death itself. He began as a runaway boy searching for freedom. He became a man who gave that freedom to others, and though his body rests in the hills above Deadwood, his spirit still rides the wind, steady, silent, and strong. Because true legends never fade. They simply watch over us from just beyond the horizon. Long after Seth Bullock was laid to rest on the hill above Deadwood, his presence never truly left the town. In life he had been the law, the order, and the conscience of the frontier. In death, many say he became its silent guardian, and nowhere is that spirit felt more than inside the grand old building that still bears his name. The Bullock Hotel. It stands on Main Street, tall and proud, built of sandstone that glows golden in the morning sun. By day, it's alive with laughter, guests checking in, the hum of voices from the restaurant, the clinking of glasses in the bar. But when night falls and the streets outside grow quiet, the Bullock Hotel becomes something else entirely, a place where the past still whispers, where the footsteps of history never quite fade away. The stories began not long after Bullock's death in 1919. Employees working late would hear doors creak open when no one was there. Lights flickered without reason, and some nights the smell of cigar smoke filled the lobby, even though smoking was forbidden. At first, people laughed it off. Just the wind, they said. But the wind doesn't wear boots, and it doesn't walk across wooden floors in the middle of the night. One night, a maid was cleaning the second-floor hallway when she heard footsteps behind her. Thinking a guest had wandered up, she turned around, but the hall was empty. Then she felt it, a sudden chill like a breath against her neck. She dropped her keys and ran, vowing never to work after dark again. Another time, a hotel manager working alone in the office heard a heavy knock on the door. He opened it, no one there. He stepped into the hall, confused, then turned back, and found a framed photo of Seth Bullock lying face down on the floor. Over the years, the stories multiplied. Guests claimed to see a tall man standing near the staircase late at night, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his eyes calm but commanding. He didn't move or speak. He simply watched, as if making sure everything was in order. Some said he appeared most often when the staff slacked off, as if he were inspecting the place, the way he used to walk the streets of Deadwood a century earlier. It was as though Sheriff Bullock was still on patrol. Even the skeptics found it hard to explain. Psychics and investigators came from all over the country, drawn by the stories. They brought cameras, recorders, and meters that measured energy and temperature. And time after time, something strange would happen. A cold spot that moved with purpose. A shadow captured on film where no person stood. Or the faint sound of boots echoing when everyone was still. To the people of Deadwood, though, these weren't tales of terror. They were stories of respect. Because Seth Bullock wasn't haunting the hotel to frighten anyone. He was protecting it, even in death. He seemed to be doing what he had always done, keeping peace, keeping order, watching over his town. Guests often describe the feeling not as fear, but as calm, as if someone is standing nearby, quietly making sure they're safe. A few even say they felt a gentle hand on their shoulder when they were alone, a touch that carried warmth, not malice. The hotel owners eventually embraced the legend. They began offering ghost tours, sharing the history of Bullock's life and the tales of his lingering spirit. Visitors walked the same halls where he once stood, tracing their fingers along the cool stone walls, listening for the echoes of the past. Sometimes, they pause outside room 211, said to be the most active spot in the building. Many believe that's where Seth's spirit lingers most strongly, still overseeing his domain. Some visitors report that they wake suddenly at night, feeling as though someone is standing at the end of the bed. Silent. Watching, protective. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain, the Bullock Hotel holds more than just bricks in history. It holds memory, the kind that doesn't fade with time. And in every creak of the floorboard, in every flicker of light, there's a reminder of a man who refused to abandon his post, even in death. Locals say that when a storm rolls through the Black Hills and thunder shakes the town, you can still see a faint figure in the window of the Bullock Hotel, a tall man in a hat standing watch over Deadwood. Some swear that if you whisper his name, Seth Bullock, you'll feel a breeze pass by, as though he's tipping his hat in quiet acknowledgement. It's not fear that lingers there. It's legacy. He built the Bullock Hotel as a monument to order, a safe haven in a dangerous world. And maybe that promise was too strong to die. Maybe that's why his spirit still walks its halls, not to haunt, but to protect, because some legends don't rest in peace. They stand guard forever. When Seth Bullock died in 1919, the West was no longer wild. The guns were silent. The gold rush had ended, and the dusty trails he once patrolled had turned into paved roads leading toward a new century. But even as time moved forward, his spirit refused to fade. Because some men don't belong to history. They belong to legend, and Seth Bullock became one of them. In the years following his death, people told his story in saloons, schoolhouses, and around campfires. They spoke of the sheriff who didn't need a gun to command respect, the marshal who brought law to chaos, and the man who turned a town of outlaws into a place of peace. To the people of Deadwood, he wasn't just a memory. He was the reason their town still stood. To the people of South Dakota, he became a symbol of courage and fairness. And to America, he came to represent something even bigger, the soul of the frontier. As the 20th century unfolded, the legend of the Old West grew stronger. Books, magazines, and eventually movies began to shape the image of the frontier hero. Brave, honest, tough, and unshakable. And though his name wasn't always shouted from the headlines, Seth Bullock's story fit that image perfectly. He was the real-life version of what the movies tried to capture, a man who believed that justice didn't come from violence, but from strength of character. Decades passed, but his name never disappeared. In 1976, the town of Deadwood celebrated its centennial, 100 years since Seth Bullock first rode into town. And at the heart of that celebration was his story. His descendants stood proudly as the townspeople honored the sheriff who had made it all possible. They raised their glasses to the man who had turned a lawless camp into a lasting community. And on that day, as the bells of Deadwood rang, it felt as though Seth himself might still be standing somewhere nearby, smiling quietly, proud of what he'd built. But the legend didn't stop there. In the early 2000s, a new generation discovered his story, not from history books, but from television. In 2004, HBO released its now famous series Deadwood, a gritty, powerful retelling of the early days of the Black Hills Gold Rush. And at its center was Seth Bullock, portrayed by actor Timothy Olyphant. Through that show, millions around the world were introduced to the man who brought justice to Deadwood. Though dramatized, the series captured something true: Bullock's unyielding spirit, his struggle to balance duty and morality, and his fierce desire to bring order to a world built on chaos. For the first time in a century, Seth Bullock became a household name again. Viewers connected deeply with him because even though he lived more than 100 years ago, his story felt timeless. He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn, serious, sometimes angry. But beneath all of that was a man driven by something pure, a belief that right and wrong still mattered. In a world full of noise, that quiet strength resonated. People saw in him what they wished they could see in themselves: the courage to stand firm, even when standing firm meant standing alone. Across America, people began visiting Deadwood again, not just for the casinos or the Gold Rush museums, but to walk where Seth Bullock once walked, to see the Bullock Hotel, to visit his grave on Mount Moriah, and to feel that connection to a man who had shaped an entire era. The town became both a memorial and a mirror, showing that the old values of honesty, loyalty, and courage still have a place in the modern world. Tour guides tell visitors that Bullock's story is not just about taming a town, it's about taming yourself. Because the greatest battles he fought weren't against outlaws. They were against fear, greed, and injustice. Even today, his name carries weight. The Mount Roosevelt Friendship Tower still stands high above the Black Hills, a monument to his bond with Theodore Roosevelt and their shared vision of America, a place built on integrity, courage, and friendship. On windy days, the tower hums with a low whistle, like the sound of distant hooves. Locals like to say it's Seth and Teddy riding again, their spirits free on the frontier. It's a comforting thought that the same hills that once echoed with gunfire now echo with memory. Seth Bullock's life was a reminder that strength doesn't come from violence. It comes from steadiness, from honor, and from a heart that refuses to give up. He proved that you could be both tough and kind, firm and fair, fierce and decent, all at the same time. In a world still searching for heroes, his story matters more than ever. Because the West he helped build wasn't just a place. It was an idea. That courage and character can turn even the wildest frontier into a home. They say the frontier ended long ago. But as long as there are people who stand for what's right, who face fear without backing down, who lead with honesty instead of pride, the spirit of the West still rides on, and somewhere, in the golden light of the Black Hills, Seth Bullock still rides with it. Before there was a legend, there was a man. And behind that man was a code. Simple, unspoken, but unbreakable. For Seth Bullock, it wasn't fame, wealth, or glory that mattered. It was doing what was right, even when no one was watching. That was his code of honor. And it was the reason he became one of the most respected men in the history of the American West. Seth's life was never easy. He didn't grow up with privilege or power. He was shaped by hardship, by a strict father, by loss, and by the harsh realities of frontier life. But those challenges didn't make him cruel. They made him disciplined. They made him understand that strength was not about control. It was about responsibility. From his earliest days as a young sheriff in Montana to his final years as U.S. Marshal, Bullock lived by the same principles. Honor the truth. Protect the innocent. Stand your ground, but never without cause. He believed that the law was not a weapon, but a shield. To him, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. He once said, "A man who carries a badge carries the weight of every person who can't protect themselves." And he lived by those words every day. When Deadwood was nothing more than a gold camp filled with chaos and greed, Bullock didn't bring order with his gun, he brought it with his presence. He showed people that authority didn't come from fear, it came from character. People in Deadwood used to say, "When Seth Bullock walks down the street, even the wind holds its breath." He didn't have to shout to be heard. He didn't have to fight to be feared. He simply stood tall, calm, and certain. That quiet confidence was his greatest weapon and his deepest strength. But Seth's code went beyond the badge. He believed in loyalty, to his friends, to his family, and to his word. When he gave a promise, he kept it. When he believed in someone, he stood by them through anything. His friendship with Theodore Roosevelt was the perfect example. They came from different worlds, one a New York aristocrat, the other a rugged lawman. Yet they shared the same belief, that honor was not something given by birth, but earned by action. When Roosevelt died, Bullock didn't just mourn him. He built a monument to him, a tower that still stands today. Because that's what his loyalty looked like. Built from stone, meant to last forever. His sense of justice also extended to those others ignored. He treated everyone, rich or poor, black or white, outlaw or rancher, with the same respect. In a time when prejudice and power ruled the frontier, Bullock stood apart. He saw people not for what they had, but for who they were. That was rare then. It's still rare now, and yet for all his strength, Seth Bullock was not without flaws. He was stubborn, sometimes short-tempered, and often too serious. He found it hard to forgive laziness or dishonesty. He could be stern, even intimidating, but behind that hard shell was a man who cared deeply. He carried the weight of his responsibilities like armor. He believed that leadership wasn't about comfort, it was about sacrifice. If he seemed distant, it was because he carried everyone else's burdens quietly, never letting them show. That was his way of protecting others. His family saw that side of him most. To his wife Martha he was devoted. To his children he was both strict and loving, teaching them that hard work and integrity mattered more than anything else. He rarely spoke about his accomplishments. He didn't see himself as a hero. To him, he was just doing what needed to be done. But those who knew him understood the truth. He lived by a standard few men could ever reach, even after his death. The people of Deadwood continued to follow the example he set. They kept their word. They worked hard. They treated others with respect, because that was Seth Bullock's true legacy, not the hotel, not the badge, not even the ghost stories. It was the moral compass he left behind, a reminder that you don't need to be the fastest gun or the loudest voice to make a difference. You just need to stand firm in what's right and never back down from it. In a world built on pride and power, Seth Bullock chose a different path, one built on principle. He believed that a man's word was his bond, his courage his strength, and his honor his legacy. And maybe that's why, even a century later, his story still matters. Because courage fades, fame fades, but character, that lives forever. More than a century has passed since Seth Bullock walked the streets of Deadwood. The world he knew is long gone. The horses, the saloons, the dusty trails. The gold has vanished. The outlaws are just names in history books, and the frontier itself has faded into legend. But something of that world still remains. Not in the land, but in the spirit. The same spirit that lived inside the man who never gave up on order, justice, and decency. The spirit of Seth Bullock. Every generation has its challenges. In Bullock's time, it was the wilderness, lawless and wild. Today, it's different kinds of chaos, faster, louder, modern. But the lesson remains the same. Courage is not about fighting others. It's about fighting the fear within. Seth Bullock showed that true strength isn't loud. It doesn't come from anger or power or pride. It comes from consistency, from doing what's right even when no one else does. That's why his story still matters. In schools and small museums across South Dakota, his name still echoes. Teachers tell students about the sheriff who kept his town safe without firing his gun. Parents bring their children to Mount Moriah Cemetery, pointing to the grave that overlooks the valley and saying, "That's the man who helped build this place." And somewhere, a young boy or girl hears that story and realizes that heroes don't always wear capes or carry weapons. Sometimes they just stand tall and refuse to give up. Modern visitors who walk through Deadwood today see a blend of history and modern life. Neon lights next to old saloons, hotels built where miners once pitched tents. But if you look closer, you'll find something deeper. You'll find a town that still honors its roots, that still remembers the man who believed civilization could grow from chaos. At the Bullock Hotel, tourists whisper about the lawman's ghost watching over them. At Mount Roosevelt, hikers climb to the top of the tower he built for his friend. And in every quiet breeze that rolls over the Black Hills, there's a feeling, the same calm strength that once filled the heart of Seth Bullock. But perhaps the greatest tribute to Bullock isn't the hotel or the monument. It's the kind of person he inspired others to be. Across America, countless people, lawmen, leaders, teachers, and everyday workers, live by the same code he once carried. Work hard, tell the truth, do your duty, stand for what's right. That's the American frontier spirit, and Seth Bullock embodied it completely. When the HBO series Deadwood aired, a new generation saw Bullock's face come alive again through actor Timothy Olyphant. The show reminded the world that the West wasn't just about gunfights and gold. It was about human beings trying to find order in the middle of chaos. And that's exactly what Seth Bullock did. The series made him famous once more, but fame was never what defined him. What made Bullock special was that he never sought attention. He sought meaning. He didn't care if history remembered him. He only cared that his town stood strong when he was gone, and because of that, history will never forget him. Seth Bullock's life is more than a Western story. It's a mirror, showing us what integrity looks like, what leadership really means, and how one person can change everything simply by refusing to break. He began as a runaway boy searching for freedom. He became a sheriff, a marshal, a builder, and a friend to a president. He built a town from ashes. He carried honor through chaos. And when he died, he left behind something far greater than gold. He left a legacy of courage and principle. Music builds softly, orchestral strings mixed with gentle drums, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Narrator, emotional, uplifting tone. History remembers the men who conquered land, but it also remembers the few who conquered themselves. Seth Bullock was one of those men, unshaken, unbending, and unafraid. He proved that justice isn't a dream, it's a choice, and that even the wildest frontier can be tamed by a man with a steady heart. The frontier may be gone, but its spirit, his spirit, still rides with us. From the heart of the Black Hills to the hearts of all who still believe in honor, Seth Bullock lives on,